The end of the investigation. For a long time, he believed the investigation had already reached its conclusion. The missing bridge had been explained away as a mapping error. The footage that briefly appeared online before vanishing had been dismissed as corrupted data. Even the strange discrepancies between archived records and personal memories had eventually faded into the background noise of everyday life. At least, that was the official explanation. The world moved forward as if nothing unusual had happened. News cycles replaced one story with another. People stopped asking questions. Whatever uncertainty had once surrounded the incident slowly dissolved into silence. And yet something about the case never felt finished. It lingered in small details that refused to align. Documents that changed depending on when they were opened. Old photographs that seemed subtly different each time he examined them. Conversations with witnesses who remembered events that, according to official records, had never taken place. At first, he assumed these were simple errors. Digital archives were imperfect. Databases occasionally overwrote themselves. Human memory was even less reliable. But the deeper he looked, the less convincing those explanations became, because the inconsistencies were not random. They followed patterns. Locations that once appeared on maps were gone. Buildings that should have stood for decades were suddenly replaced by empty lots or completely different structures. Entire news reports referenced incidents that no longer existed in any searchable database. Each anomaly, taken alone, could be ignored. Together they formed something else entirely. A trail. And that trail eventually led him to a place no ordinary investigation was supposed to reach. It started with a small irregularity buried inside a restricted archive, a file that appeared in the system without a timestamp. No creation date, no author, no department responsible for uploading it, just a label. Internal monitoring record. He expected the file to be empty, or perhaps corrupted like so many other fragments he had encountered during the investigation. Instead, it opened instantly. The screen filled with structured data, system logs, and automated reports written in a tone so clinical it barely resembled human language. Line after line described events not as stories, but as variables. Population metrics, structural stability indicators, probability models predicting future outcomes with unsettling precision. At first, the information made little sense. The entries did not describe crimes, disasters, or historical records. They described corrections, events that had supposedly occurred and then been adjusted, a bridge appearing where none had been built, a building removed before its collapse could occur, an accident that vanished from every timeline except the one stored inside this archive. The deeper he scrolled, the more the pattern revealed itself. Reality, according to these records, was not fixed. It was maintained by something called the Correction Authority, an organization that did not simply respond to events, it rewrote them. Entire pieces of history had been quietly adjusted to preserve stability. Errors removed, instabilities corrected, outcomes rewritten before the public ever had the chance to notice that anything had gone wrong. For years, perhaps decades, the system had been running in the background of the world, silent, invisible, untouchable, until tonight. Because as he continued scrolling through the archive, another entry appeared at the bottom of the screen. A new record, recently created, still updating in real time. And for the first time since the investigation began, he realized something that changed everything. The case had not ended. It had only just begun. The files that should not exist. At first, he assumed the archive was incomplete. The system logs were too precise, too methodical, to belong to any ordinary database. Each entry was structured with mechanical clarity, listing time markers, probability calculations, and outcome models that seemed to describe events before they happened. He scrolled slowly, expecting to eventually reach the corrupted section that explained everything. Instead, the records only became stranger. The files were organized under a directory labeled Timeline Stability Management. Beneath it, hundreds of smaller folders stretched down the screen, each assigned a code instead of a name. Timeline 03, Timeline 07, Timeline 11, and then many more. At first glance, they looked like simulations, predictive models used by governments or research institutions to estimate future scenarios. But something about the structure didn't match that explanation. Simulations usually dealt in possibilities. These files described decisions. He opened one of the earlier entries. The interface loaded instantly, displaying a report formatted with sterile precision. Event classification, infrastructure failure, location, urban transport network, probability of cascade failure, 82.1%. Below the numbers was a short summary. A bridge collapse had been predicted, not a major one, only a regional disaster that would disrupt traffic and claim several lives before emergency services contained the damage. Normally, such a prediction would exist only as a warning, but this report continued further. Correction status executed. He frowned. Executed? A series of system notes followed. The bridge had been removed from the approved development plans months before construction began. Funding redirected, permits quietly withdrawn. In the public record, the project had never existed, which meant the collapse had never happened. The file ended with a single line, timeline stability restored. He leaned back in his chair. The explanation forming in his mind felt absurd, yet the evidence on the screen refused to allow any simpler interpretation. The system wasn't predicting disasters, it was preventing them. By editing reality before the events could occur, he opened another file. This one described a manufacturing plant scheduled to experience a chemical chain reaction during a routine maintenance procedure. The projected explosion would have contaminated several districts and forced a long-term evacuation. The correction method was different. Instead of removing the facility from history, the system introduced a minor regulatory delay, just enough to shift the maintenance schedule by 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, a separate inspection identified the faulty equipment responsible for the reaction. The disaster disappeared. The file closed with the same phrase, timeline stability restored. He kept scrolling. Another record. A commercial airliner that would have experienced a navigation malfunction over the ocean. Correction method. Software patch deployed early through an unrelated update. Another. A hospital data breach that could have triggered a financial panic. Correction method. Server relocation approved under a different budget proposal. Each file described a moment where reality had drifted toward chaos. And each time, something intervened quietly, invisibly, adjusting the chain of events just enough to steer the world back toward stability. No announcements, no public acknowledgement, just corrections. The deeper he explored the archive, the more unsettling the pattern became. The corrections were not random acts of intervention. They followed a strict logic, guided by probability models that evaluated the long-term stability of entire regions, cities, economies, governments. The system didn't simply protect individuals, it protected the timeline itself. Then he noticed something else. At the bottom of several files was a small notation that had gone unnoticed before. Authority, Correction Division. He searched the term inside the database. The system returned a single result, an internal directory labeled Correction Authority. When he opened it, the interface paused for the first time since the archive had loaded. For a moment, the cursor blinked on an empty screen. Then the folder expanded. Hundreds of additional records appeared, far larger than the ones he had already seen. Major historical events, economic collapses, military conflicts, entries stretching back decades, maybe even longer. For the first time since beginning the investigation, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his mind. The files on this screen were not meant to exist, not for the public, not for investigators, possibly not for anyone outside the system that created them. And yet somehow tonight, he was looking directly at the mechanism that kept the world from breaking apart. A hidden infrastructure designed to correct reality itself, which meant one thing was now painfully clear. If these files were real, then the version of history everyone believed in was only the one that had survived the edits. The city marked for correction. For several minutes, he simply stared at the archive. The realization that reality might be quietly maintained by an unseen system was difficult enough to accept. But what disturbed him more was the scale of the records stored inside the Correction Authority's database. Hundreds of files, maybe thousands, each one documenting a moment when the world had nearly gone wrong, and each one ending with the same quiet conclusion. Timeline stability restored. He scrolled further. The earlier entries mostly described small adjustments, infrastructure changes, policy delays, software patches, minor interventions that subtly redirected events before they could grow into disasters. But as the archive moved closer to the present day, the reports began to look different, more complex, more urgent. The probability models expanded across multiple pages. Simulations branched into dozens of potential outcomes. Entire regions appeared inside the predictive calculations, as if the system was no longer correcting isolated incidents, but managing the stability of whole populations. Then a new notification appeared at the bottom of the screen, a file that had not been there before. It carried a red classification label, Anomaly detected. The timestamp was current, updating in real time. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. The interface shifted instantly. Unlike the previous records, this report began with a large projection window filling most of the screen. Inside it was a three-dimensional model of a city. Streets formed a dense grid beneath clusters of buildings. Traffic lines moved through intersections in glowing patterns, simulating the constant flow of daily life. For a brief moment, the model looked completely ordinary. Then the simulation began to run. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Vehicles followed their routes. Pedestrians crossed intersections. Lights changed according to schedule. The system measured thousands of variables simultaneously, displaying them along the edges of the interface. Population density, infrastructure load, energy distribution, communication networks. Everything appeared stable until the model advanced further into the projected timeline. That was when the numbers began to change. Small fluctuations appeared in the stability index. Infrastructure loads shifted beyond their predicted ranges. Data traffic surged through communication nodes that had not been designed to handle the increase. The simulation accelerated. Buildings flickered with warning markers. Transport routes collapsed into red error lines. Entire districts darkened as the energy grid struggled to maintain balance. He leaned closer to the screen. The pattern looked familiar. It wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was something worse. A cascade. One system failing just enough to destabilize another, then another, and another. Traffic disruptions caused emergency response delays. Power fluctuations triggered equipment failures. Financial systems reacted to the sudden uncertainty, amplifying the instability across the city. Within minutes of simulated time, the model began to fracture. Structures disappeared from the projection. Road networks disconnected from the surrounding grid. Sections of the city simply faded out of existence as the timeline calculations failed to maintain consistency. A warning appeared across the top of the interface. Reality divergence detected. The simulation paused automatically. Additional models loaded beside the original. 10 different projections. 20, 50. Each one testing a different intervention. Emergency response improvements, infrastructure reinforcement, policy adjustments. Every scenario ended the same way. The instability spread faster than the corrections could contain it. The system continued running deeper probability calculations. The numbers stabilized for a moment before updating again. A final prediction appeared beneath the projection window. Reality failure. Probability, 97.4%. He exhaled slowly. The correction authority had seen disasters before. That much was obvious from the archive. But this was different. The earlier records described specific events, collapses, accidents, chain reactions that could be prevented by altering a few small details. This anomaly wasn't a single event. It was a structural failure inside the timeline itself. Something about the city had drifted so far from stable probability that the system could no longer guide it back with minor adjustments. For several seconds, the interface remained frozen on the prediction model. Then a new section expanded beneath the analysis. Correction protocol required. Another document loaded automatically. Unlike the earlier simulations, this one contained no branching scenarios, just a single plan. A boundary appeared around the digital city, glowing faintly against the dark background of the projection. Coordinates filled the side panel. Population metrics, structural density, long-term timeline impact. He felt a strange tension building in his chest as the system finished compiling the report. Because the scale of the correction zone was enormous. Entire districts, highways, residential areas, everything inside the boundary shared the same classification. correction target. The city had not simply been flagged as unstable, it had been marked as the source of a reality fracture that the system could no longer repair with subtle edits. The projection window zoomed closer to the center of the map. Street names became visible, familiar landmarks, public squares, apartment towers. Thousands of individual lives represented as moving data points inside the simulation, all of them continuing their ordinary routines, completely unaware that somewhere beyond their understanding, a hidden system had just determined something terrifying. The timeline could not survive if the city remained. And for the first time since opening the archive, he understood what the Correction Authority was preparing to do next. Erase the city to save reality. For a long moment, he didn't move. The projection of the city still hovered on the screen, glowing softly in the dim light of the monitor. Streets pulsed with simulated traffic patterns. Residential districts flickered with population indicators. Tiny markers represented hospitals, schools, power stations, and transit hubs, all functioning together inside the delicate balance that allowed millions of people to live their daily lives. To anyone else, it would have looked like an ordinary urban model, but he now understood what it really was: a system deciding whether that entire place should continue to exist. The interface shifted again. A new document opened beneath the simulation window, its formatting identical to the previous correction reports he had seen in the archive. Clean lines, neutral language, no emotion anywhere in the text, just calculations. At the top of the page was a title: Correction Method, Full Urban Reset. He read the words twice, hoping they meant something less final than they sounded. They did not. The report began with a summary of the anomaly. According to the system's analysis, the city had entered a state of long-term timeline instability. Too many small variables had drifted outside their predicted ranges. Infrastructure systems were interconnected in ways that amplified failure instead of containing it. Economic activity had shifted regional dependencies, increasing pressure on supply networks that were already near their limits. Individually, none of those changes would have been catastrophic. Together, they formed a fragile structure that the timeline could no longer support. The simulation data confirmed it. Every projection ended with the same result: collapse. Not a sudden explosion or a dramatic disaster. Something quieter and far more destructive. Systems failing gradually until reality itself could no longer reconcile the contradictions inside the timeline. And when that happened, the fractures would not remain contained inside the city. They would spread outward. Transport networks connecting to neighboring regions would destabilize. Financial markets reacting to the collapse would trigger wider economic failures. Emergency infrastructure would be overwhelmed long before the scale of the crisis was fully understood. The report estimated that within 18 months, the instability would propagate through multiple national systems. Within 3 years, the probability models predicted a global cascade. The Correction Authority had clearly run every possible intervention. Pages of simulations followed the summary, each labeled with different mitigation strategies: urban infrastructure reinforcement, energy grid redesign, population redistribution, emergency policy intervention. One by one, the system had tested them, and one by one, they had failed. The instability was too deeply embedded in the structure of the city's timeline. Too many variables were already locked into place by past decisions, past events, past consequences that could no longer be undone. For the first time in the archive, the Correction Authority had reached the limit of subtle intervention. No policy change could solve it. No early warning could redirect it. The timeline had already moved too far in the wrong direction, which left only one option. He continued reading. The full urban reset protocol described a correction strategy far more extreme than anything he had seen in the earlier files. Instead of adjusting individual events, the system would eliminate the entire source of instability from the timeline, not by destroying the city in the present, but by removing it from history. Construction approvals that had allowed the city to expand decades earlier would be quietly altered. Key infrastructure investments would be redirected to other regions. Economic development projects would never receive funding. Migration patterns would shift slowly over time, until the population never concentrated in that location at all. From the perspective of history, the city would simply never form. Its buildings would never be constructed. Its neighborhoods would never exist. Every person who currently lived there would grow up somewhere else, living completely different lives inside a timeline that had quietly diverged from the one he knew. No explosions, no evacuations, no visible disaster. Just the silent disappearance of an entire city from the past. The report estimated that the correction would stabilize global timeline probability within a margin of less than 1%. In other words, it would work. Reality would survive. But the cost was written clearly in the population metrics listed along the side of the report. Millions of lives, millions of personal histories, families that would never meet, children who would never be born, memories that would never exist. All erased, not because those people had done anything wrong, but because the structure of the world required their city to vanish. He scrolled further down the page. At the bottom of the report was a final section labeled Implementation Status. The system had already completed its analysis. The correction plan had been approved internally. All that remained was authorization. A progress indicator waited beside the command line. Correction ready, awaiting execution. For years, perhaps decades, the Correction Authority had quietly protected the timeline by adjusting events before they could spiral into chaos. Most of the world would never know those corrections had taken place. Most of the world would never understand how fragile reality actually was. But this time, the intervention wasn't small. This time, the correction wasn't invisible. This time, the system was preparing to remove something enormous. The projection window slowly zoomed back out, displaying the full map of the city again. From above, it looked peaceful. Cars moving through intersections, lights glowing in apartment towers, people walking along sidewalks, completely unaware that somewhere beyond their understanding, a hidden system had just reached a conclusion about their future, or rather, the absence of one. And according to the cold calculations of the Correction Authority, the decision was simple. If the city remained, reality itself might collapse. If the city disappeared, the world would remain stable. The system had done the math. The solution was clear. Erase the city. Save the timeline. The system gives him control. For several seconds, he simply stared at the screen. The correction report remained open, its cold logic frozen in front of him. Numbers, probability models, and structured calculations filled the interface, all pointing toward the same conclusion. The system had already decided what needed to happen. The city would be removed from the timeline. Not destroyed, not abandoned, removed. A quiet absence written into history so completely that no one would ever realize anything had changed. He should have closed the file. He should have stepped away from the terminal and convinced himself that this archive was something he had never truly accessed, something meant for systems far beyond human authority. But curiosity had carried him this far, and now it refused to let go. He moved the cursor slowly across the screen, scanning the final section of the report. Implementation status, ready awaiting execution. The correction protocol appeared to be fully automated. Once initiated, the system would begin rewriting the necessary historical variables, altering decades of decisions and events with surgical precision. Funding approvals would vanish. Infrastructure projects would be redirected. Migration patterns would shift just enough to prevent the population center from forming. By the time the correction reached the present day, the city would simply not exist. The process looked inevitable, until the interface changed. Without warning, the archive window minimized itself. A new terminal panel slid into place at the center of the screen, interrupting the report. At first, he thought the system had detected his presence, a security protocol, a shutdown sequence. But the text that appeared was something else entirely. User authentication in progress. The cursor blinked. Lines of code moved across the terminal faster than he could read them. Access tokens, system pathways, administrative directories. Then the scrolling stopped. A single message appeared. Administrator access detected. He frowned. That didn't make sense. He wasn't an administrator of anything connected to this archive. The correction authority's systems clearly operated at a level far beyond ordinary government infrastructure. If such an organization truly existed, its access credentials would be among the most restricted in the world. And yet the system had just recognized him. Another message appeared beneath the first. Privilege verification complete. The interface expanded again, revealing a new control panel that had not been visible before. Two command fields appeared in the center of the screen, each one framed by thin lines of white text, each one representing a decision. He leaned forward slightly. The first command field was labeled AUTHORIZE CORRECTION. The description beneath it was brief. Initiate full urban reset protocol. Timeline stability projected to return to acceptable probability thresholds. In other words, if he approved the command, the system would begin the process of erasing the city from history. The world would remain stable, reality would remain intact, but millions of lives would quietly dissolve into alternate versions that no one would ever remember. He shifted his attention to the second command field, block correction. This description was longer. Prevent timeline intervention. Allow anomaly progression within current reality model. A smaller warning appeared below it. Projected outcome, global instability probability exceeds acceptable limits. He read the text again. If he blocked the correction, the system would do nothing. The city would remain exactly as it was. The timeline would continue moving forward without interference. But the simulations had already shown what that meant. The instability would spread. Infrastructure failures, economic cascades, systems collapsing in slow, irreversible waves until the world itself could no longer maintain its fragile balance. He leaned back in the chair. The room around him was silent, except for the low hum of the computer. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary evening routines. Traffic lights changed at intersections. Headlights slid across the wet pavement. People walked along sidewalks, carrying groceries, talking on phones, living lives that had no awareness of the calculations unfolding inside this hidden system. None of them knew the correction authority existed. None of them knew that somewhere behind the structure of reality, an invisible mechanism constantly adjusted events to keep the world from falling apart. And now, somehow, that mechanism had handed him the controls. He studied the terminal again. There were no additional instructions, no confirmation prompts, just the two commands waiting for input: authorize correction or block correction. The simplicity of the interface made the situation feel even more surreal. Years of hidden timeline management, decades of invisible corrections, all reduced to 2 lines of text, 2 possible futures. He wondered how many times this screen had appeared before. Had someone else made these decisions in the past? Had the correction authority always relied on a human operator to authorize its most extreme interventions? Or was this moment something new? Some strange alignment of system permissions that had accidentally placed him in a position he was never meant to occupy? He moved the cursor slightly. The command fields responded with a faint glow. The system was waiting, patient, neutral. It did not argue for one outcome over the other. It did not attempt to influence his choice. It simply presented the information and waited for a decision that would reshape the structure of reality itself. He glanced once more at the correction report still visible in the background window. The city remained highlighted inside the projection model. Millions of small data points continued moving through the simulated streets. People driving home from work, children finishing homework, restaurants closing for the night. Every life inside that digital map was being quietly weighed against the stability of the entire world. If he authorized the correction, those lives would not end. They would simply become different. Different places, different families, different histories that no one would ever know had replaced the ones that currently existed. And if he refused, the system had already calculated the consequences. Reality would begin to fracture. The cascade would spread beyond the city, and eventually, far more than one place might disappear. The cursor blinked again at the center of the screen. 2 commands, 2 futures, and somehow the system had decided that the choice belonged to him. Stability or truth. The cursor blinked in the center of the screen, a quiet, steady pulse of light, waiting. For a moment, he didn't touch the keyboard. The two commands sat side by side in the terminal window, simple and precise in a way that felt almost cruel. Authorize correction, block correction. Years of invisible intervention by the correction authority had led to this moment. Every adjustment in the archive, every quiet change to history had followed the same philosophy. Preserve the stability of reality. Prevent collapse before it begins. Most of those corrections had been small. Infrastructure delays, software updates, minor shifts in policy or planning that redirected events just enough to avoid disaster. No one noticed. The world simply continued moving forward. But this time the scale was different. This time the system was asking for something enormous. He looked back at the projection window showing the city. From above, it looked peaceful. Traffic flowed along the highways like thin lines of light. Apartment towers glowed with the quiet presence of people living their lives. Parks and plazas appeared as small, dark shapes between clusters of buildings. Nothing about the scene suggested instability. Nothing suggested that, according to the calculations running behind the interface, the place was slowly drifting toward a fracture that could spread through the timeline itself. He leaned closer to the monitor. The population metrics still scrolled quietly along the side of the simulation. Millions of individuals, each represented by a small moving point of data. It was impossible to think of them as numbers. They were people. Teachers walking home from work, engineers finishing late shifts, children falling asleep in rooms lit by the glow of night lamps. Entire histories unfolding moment by moment, and the system was asking him to decide whether those histories should continue. He looked at the first command again. Authorize correction. If he selected it, the full urban reset protocol would begin immediately. The system would reach backward through decades of timeline variables, carefully altering key events that had allowed the city to grow into its current form. Development approvals would disappear. Transportation investments would be redirected to other regions. Economic incentives would quietly shift population growth somewhere else. None of it would look dramatic. History would simply unfold differently. By the time the corrected timeline reached the present day, the city would not exist. Every person currently living there would instead grow up somewhere else. Different schools, different neighborhoods, different lives, perhaps better ones, perhaps worse. There would be no way to know. The important thing, the only thing the correction authority cared about, was that the instability would vanish. The world would remain stable. Reality would continue functioning as it always had. He shifted his gaze to the second command, block correction. The description beneath it was blunt. Allow anomaly progression within current timeline. The simulation windows beside the terminal quietly updated, showing the same cascade models he had already examined earlier. At first, the failures were small. Traffic congestion disrupting emergency services, power fluctuations damaging critical infrastructure, communication networks overwhelmed by sudden surges in demand. But those failures didn't remain isolated. They multiplied. Transportation disruptions affected supply chains. Financial systems reacted to uncertainty. Public institutions struggled to respond quickly enough to stabilize the situation. Within months, the city itself would begin to fracture. Districts falling into partial collapse. Public systems failing faster than they could be repaired. Millions of people forced into migration patterns that surrounding regions were not prepared to absorb. And beyond that, the timeline projections became harder to interpret. Global economic instability, political structures destabilized by resource strain, infrastructure networks collapsing across multiple regions as the cascade spread outward. The final simulation frames were incomplete. The system couldn't fully predict the outcome, only the probability. Global stability failure, high risk. He exhaled slowly. The correction authority had designed its philosophy around a simple principle. Reality must remain stable. That principle justified every quiet adjustment in the archive, every disaster prevented, every historical detail subtly altered. From the perspective of the system, the decision in front of him was obvious. Erase the city, save the world. But sitting in front of the terminal, the logic felt less clear. Because the system did not experience the consequences of its choices, it didn't understand what it meant to remove an entire place from history, to erase memories that had already happened, to rewrite lives that were currently being lived. For the correction authority, those were acceptable variables inside a probability model. For him, they felt real. He imagined the corrected timeline unfolding, a different version of the world where the city had never existed, where the people currently walking those streets had grown up somewhere else, where friendships, relationships, and entire families had formed along completely different paths. Would those alternate lives be better, worse, or simply different in ways no one inside that timeline would ever recognize? And then there was the other possibility. If he blocked the correction, the city would remain exactly as it was. No silent edits to the past. No hidden intervention guiding the structure of reality. The truth would remain intact. But the consequences of that truth could destroy far more than a single city. The cascade models made that clear. The instability spreading through global systems, the slow fracture of infrastructure networks, the possibility that the world itself might eventually reach a point where stability could no longer be restored. Millions of lives erased by the correction, or billions endangered by the collapse. The system reduced the decision to 2 commands, but the weight behind those commands was almost impossible to measure. He looked out the window again. The city outside continued moving as if nothing unusual was happening. Headlights drifted through intersections. A train passed somewhere in the distance. People lived their lives without knowing that the structure of reality might depend on a decision being made inside this quiet room. And maybe that was the most unsettling part of all. The world had always felt stable, predictable, governed by physical laws and human choices. But the archive had revealed something different. For years, perhaps for generations, an unseen system had been guiding the timeline away from catastrophe, quietly correcting events before they could spiral into chaos. Reality itself had been maintained like a fragile machine. And now, for the first time since discovering that truth, he understood the deeper question hiding behind the terminal window. Was the world stable because it deserved to be, or because something had always been willing to rewrite it? The cursor blinked again, patient, neutral, waiting for the answer to a question that the correction authority itself could never fully resolve. What mattered more, the stability of reality, or the truth of the timeline that had already happened? His hand moved slowly toward the keyboard. The terminal waited. 2 commands, 2 futures, and 1 decision that would determine which version of the world continued to exist. He refuses to fix reality. For a long time, he didn't move. The terminal window remained open in front of him, silent except for the steady blinking of the cursor. The 2 commands still waited exactly where they had been moments earlier, unchanged, patient, almost indifferent to the weight they carried. Authorize correction block correction. The system had given him control, or at least the illusion of it. He studied the words again, searching for something hidden behind their simplicity. Some indication that the decision was not as absolute as it appeared. But the interface offered nothing more, no additional options, no warnings beyond the cold probability models he had already seen. Just the 2 possible outcomes: a stable world built on an edited past, or an uncertain future where reality was left untouched. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Inside his mind, the archive replayed itself piece by piece. The bridge that had never been built, the factory explosion that had quietly vanished from the timeline, the airliner malfunction that never occurred because a software update had arrived a few days earlier than expected. Hundreds of corrections, maybe thousands, every one of them designed to keep the world balanced on the narrow path of stability. And until tonight, no one outside the correction authority had ever known those adjustments existed. The system had worked silently, efficiently, perfectly, which raised a question he could no longer ignore. If reality had been corrected this many times already, then how much of the world people believed in was actually real? How many disasters had been erased before they could happen? How many lives had been quietly rewritten without anyone noticing? How many entire versions of history had already been replaced by safer alternatives? The thought left a strange emptiness in his chest, because if the system had been doing this for decades, then the timeline humanity experienced might not be the original one at all. It might simply be the most stable version, a carefully maintained illusion. He opened his eyes again and looked at the city projection on the screen. The model continued running quietly in the background, unaware that its existence was being debated. Lights flickered across the digital skyline as simulated night settled over the streets. Somewhere inside that map were millions of people living ordinary lives, people who had no idea that their entire city was now classified as a threat to reality itself. According to the calculations, erasing them would save the world. But the more he thought about it, the more the logic began to feel wrong. Not because the numbers were incorrect. The system had proven its accuracy again and again. The cascade models were clear. If the anomaly continued unchecked, the consequences could spread far beyond a single city. The collapse might reach global scale. But the alternative carried its own kind of catastrophe, because authorizing the correction would mean accepting a world where reality could be rewritten whenever the system decided stability was more important than truth. A world where entire histories could disappear without anyone realizing they had existed. A world where every moment of human experience was subject to quiet revision. He stared at the terminal again. The correction authority believed stability justified those decisions. From a purely logical perspective, they were probably right. But something about the idea felt deeply wrong. Reality wasn't supposed to be edited like a document. History wasn't supposed to be corrected whenever it became inconvenient. The world was messy, unpredictable, full of consequences that no system could perfectly control. Maybe that chaos was dangerous. Maybe it could even destroy everything. But it was also real. And the moment someone began rewriting reality to remove every risk, the world stopped being authentic. It became something else. A carefully managed version of existence where the truth of events no longer mattered, only the outcome. He imagined the corrected timeline again. The city gone, millions of lives redirected into different paths that no one would remember replacing the original ones. From the perspective of that new reality, everything would seem normal, stable, orderly, but the truth would be gone, erased so completely that even the people living inside the corrected world would never know it had existed. He realized something then. If he authorized the correction, the system would not simply erase the city. It would erase the evidence that the city had ever been threatened. No one would remember this moment. No one would remember the choice. The correction authority would continue doing its work, quietly editing the timeline whenever instability appeared. And the world would go on believing that reality had always been exactly the way it was, perfectly stable, perfectly natural, a carefully maintained illusion. The cursor blinked again, waiting. He slowly moved the mouse across the terminal window. The first command field glowed faintly as the cursor passed over it. Authorize correction. He paused, then moved the cursor away. It settled over the second option, block correction. The warning text appeared again beneath the command. Projected outcome, timeline instability. He read the words one more time. Then he took a slow breath. Maybe the system was right. Maybe the world would fracture without intervention. Maybe the cascade would spread exactly as the simulations predicted. But at least the timeline would remain honest. Reality would not be rewritten. History would belong to the people living it, not to a hidden system correcting it from the shadows. He rested his hand on the keyboard. For the first time since discovering the archive, the decision felt clear. He pressed the key. The command executed instantly. Block correction. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The terminal accepted the input without sound. Then a new line appeared beneath the command. Correction protocol terminated. The city projection continued glowing quietly on the screen. The timeline remained exactly as it was. For better or worse, reality would not be fixed. System response. For several seconds after the command executed, nothing changed. The terminal remained open. The cursor continued blinking exactly where it had before. Block correction. Correction protocol terminated. The words sat quietly on the screen as if they carried no weight at all. But he knew better. Somewhere inside the vast architecture of the correction authority systems, a decision had just been recorded. A correction protocol that had already been calculated, approved, and prepared for execution had been stopped. Not delayed, stopped. The city would remain. The timeline would continue forward without intervention. He waited for the system to react, an alert, a warning, some indication that a command of this magnitude had triggered a deeper response inside the network. But the archive remained strangely calm. The projection of the city still hovered in the background window, its quiet simulation continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. Traffic moved through intersections, population markers drifted across residential districts, power grids pulsed with steady patterns of energy distribution. Life inside the model continued exactly as before. For a moment, it felt almost anticlimactic, as if reality itself had simply accepted his choice and moved on. Then the interface flickered, not dramatically, just a small shift in the terminal window. A new line of text appeared beneath the previous command. System review initiated. He leaned slightly closer to the monitor. Another line followed. Timeline. Stability reassessment in progress. Behind the terminal, the simulation window began to change. The city projection zoomed outward, pulling the camera perspective higher above the digital landscape. The surrounding regions came into view. Highways stretched across neighboring territories. Rail networks connected distant industrial zones. The system was expanding the scope of its calculations. The correction had been blocked, which meant the anomaly would now be allowed to evolve naturally. Probability models began appearing across the edges of the screen again. New projections, new timelines branching outward from the moment he had just created. At first, the changes looked small. Traffic density predictions fluctuated slightly. Emergency response simulations adjusted their timing variables. Energy grid stress levels rose by a fraction of a percentage point. But as the simulation continued, the numbers began to shift more dramatically. Infrastructure stress indicators turned yellow, then orange. Transportation nodes flickered with warning markers. The cascade had begun. He watched the model advance through projected time, weeks, months. The system processed thousands of variables simultaneously, recalculating possible outcomes for every sector connected to the city's network. Supply chains, financial systems, population movement, communication infrastructure. Each model responded differently to the growing instability. Some predicted manageable disruption. Others suggested far more severe consequences. But every scenario shared the same underlying pattern. Without intervention, the anomaly would spread. Another message appeared in the terminal. Passive monitoring. The words surprised him. Passive monitoring. Not forced override. Not emergency intervention. The system had accepted the command. The correction authority would no longer attempt to repair the anomaly. It would simply observe. He wasn't sure why that unsettled him more than resistance would have. If the system had overridden his decision, at least it would have confirmed that the authority behind the archive still controlled reality. But this response suggested something else. The command had been final. Whoever, or whatever, designed the correction authority had allowed for the possibility that a correction might be refused. The system had not been built to force stability. It had been built to offer it. Another set of simulations appeared on the screen. Long-term projections. 5 years, 10, 20. The outcomes became increasingly uncertain as the timeline extended further into the future. The models began diverging from each other, producing wildly different possibilities, depending on how the cascade interacted with human responses. In some projections, the city adapted. Infrastructure reforms slowed the spread of instability. Regional cooperation stabilized supply networks. New technologies shifted economic pressures in ways the original models had not predicted. In others, the collapse accelerated. Entire districts fell into permanent infrastructure failure. Migration crises destabilized neighboring regions. Economic shockwaves rippled through global systems. The future had become unpredictable. For the first time since he opened the archive, the timeline was no longer being carefully guided toward a stable outcome. It was free. The terminal updated once more. A final message appeared beneath the monitoring logs. Timeline status, uncorrected. He stared at the words. Uncorrected, not broken, not destroyed, just uncorrected. Reality would now unfold without intervention from the hidden system that had quietly maintained it for decades. Whatever happened next would be the result of natural consequences, human decisions, and unpredictable chance. The projection window slowly returned to the view of the city itself. Night still covered the digital skyline. Cars continued moving along the highways. Apartment lights glowed softly in thousands of buildings. Nothing in the model suggested that anything had changed. But he knew something fundamental had shifted. For years, the Correction Authority had shaped the timeline behind the scenes, protecting the world from its most dangerous outcomes. Now, for the first time in who knew how long, the system was no longer correcting reality. It was simply watching what would happen without it. The cycle begins again. At first, there was nothing, no alarms, no system warnings, no dramatic confirmation that the decision had altered the structure of reality. The terminal window remained open for a few seconds longer, quietly displaying the final system message: timeline status, uncorrected. Then the screen went dark, not abruptly, just a gradual dimming, as if the monitor had simply lost interest in continuing the conversation. The projection of the city faded away. The terminal interface disappeared. The blinking cursor vanished along with it. The room fell into silence. For a moment, the darkness felt complete, and then the image slowly returned. Not the archive, not the Correction Authority system. A different scene entirely. A desk, a dimly lit room, a computer monitor glowing softly in the darkness. Outside the window, the quiet rhythm of the city continued as usual. Headlights slid through intersections. A distant train passed somewhere beyond the buildings. The ordinary sounds of nighttime life filled the air. Everything looked familiar, because it was. The scene was almost identical to the one where the investigation had first begun. The same desk, the same chair, the same quiet room illuminated only by the pale light of a computer screen. A man sat in front of the monitor, leaning slightly forward as if concentrating on something he had just discovered. For a few seconds, nothing unusual seemed to be happening. He moved the mouse. The cursor shifted across the screen. A file window sat open on the desktop. From this distance, the title was difficult to read, but the shape of the interface was recognizable. An archive, rows of data, system logs, records organized with cold mechanical precision. It looked exactly like the database that had revealed the existence of the Correction Authority. But there was a difference, a small one. The camera slowly moved closer to the monitor, closer to the open file, closer to the title at the top of the document. The text finally became clear. Anomaly detected. The words sat quietly at the top of the screen. Beneath them, a series of probability models began loading automatically. Coordinates appeared, infrastructure stability metrics, population density calculations, the same type of analysis that had once identified the city as a threat to the timeline. For a moment, the man at the desk simply stared at the data. His expression was calm, curious, the expression of someone who had just stumbled onto something unusual inside a database that wasn't supposed to contain unusual things. Another line appeared beneath the anomaly report. System access requested. The cursor blinked, waiting. A moment later, the system continued. Authentication in progress. Lines of code scrolled across the terminal window. Security pathways, administrative directories, authorization checks. Then the scrolling stopped. A single message appeared in the center of the screen. Administrate, and the man leaned slightly closer to the monitor. Confusion flickered across his face. He hadn't typed anything. He hadn't requested access, yet the system had just recognized him. Another panel slowly opened beneath the anomaly report. Two command fields appeared in the terminal interface. Two options, exactly the same ones that had appeared earlier. Authorize correction block correction. The cursor blinked patiently between them. Outside the window, the city lights continued glowing across the skyline. Inside the room, the quiet hum of the computer filled the air. The man studied the screen carefully, still trying to understand what he had just found. Somewhere deep inside the hidden architecture of the Correction Authority, the system had begun preparing another intervention, another anomaly, another possible correction, another decision waiting to be made. He rested his hand on the mouse. The cursor moved slowly across the terminal window, hovering, waiting. The cycle had not ended, it had simply reset. And once again, reality was waiting for someone to decide whether it should be corrected. The choice was the reset. For a long time, humanity believed reality moved in a straight line, past leading into present, present leading into future. One continuous chain of events unfolding through time, shaped by decisions, accidents, and the unpredictable nature of life itself. History was supposed to be permanent. What had already happened could not be changed. But the archive had revealed something different. For decades, perhaps far longer than anyone outside the system could imagine, reality had not been entirely natural. Hidden behind the surface of everyday life was an invisible structure quietly maintaining the timeline, the correction authority. A system built to protect the world from collapse. Every time the timeline drifted too close to catastrophe, the system intervened. Small adjustments redirected events before they could spiral into disasters. Infrastructure failures vanished before they occurred. Accidents dissolved into alternate outcomes that no one remembered, replacing the originals. Reality continued forward, stable, predictable, safe, because someone or something had always been willing to correct it. But corrections came with a cost. Each intervention rewrote history in subtle ways. Entire possibilities disappeared, replaced by safer alternatives. Lives unfolded along paths that had been carefully adjusted to preserve stability rather than truth. Most people would never know. From inside the corrected timeline, the world always looked natural. Events appeared to unfold exactly as they should. Only the hidden archive remembered the versions that had been erased. And eventually, one anomaly had grown too large for subtle corrections to contain. A city marked for removal, millions of lives scheduled to vanish quietly from the past. A final intervention meant to preserve the stability of reality itself. The system had calculated the outcome with perfect precision, erased the city, saved the world. But when the moment came to execute the correction, something unexpected happened. The system asked for permission. Two commands appeared: authorize correction, block correction. For the first time in who knew how long, the future of the timeline depended on a human decision, and the answer had been simple: he refused. Reality would not be rewritten again. The command had been executed: block correction. At that moment, it seemed like the story had ended. The system accepted the choice. The timeline remained uncorrected. But what he didn't understand then, what no one inside the moment could possibly understand, was that the decision had triggered something deeper inside the structure of the correction authority. Because the system had not been designed to simply correct reality, it had been designed to protect the timeline itself. If instability grew too large, if a correction was refused, if the timeline drifted beyond the limits of safe probability, the system had another solution. Not correction, reset. The archive would close, the system would restart, and somewhere, sometime, the anomaly would appear again. Another investigation would begin, another discovery, another moment where the same two commands waited quietly inside a terminal window. Authorize correction, block correction. From the perspective of the person making the decision, it would always feel like the first time, but the archive would know the truth. The choice had never been the end of the story. It had always been the mechanism that started it again. Because in the architecture of the correction authority, the timeline was not just corrected, it was recycled, and every cycle ended the same way. Reality waiting patiently for someone to decide whether it should be fixed.
Shadows